Creed 3 marks the 9th movie in the entire Rocky franchise, and over the last 2 months, I watched every single one of these movies for the very first time. And now that Creed 3 is hitting theaters this weekend, here's my ranking for all 9 of the movies from the worst to the best. Watching this franchise for the very first time was such an amazing experience. I fell in love with the characters and the stories, and I feel like this is one of the most consistently good franchises. And before we get into it, let me know your ranking for all 9 of the movies in the Rocky franchise in the comments down below. But without wasting any more time, let's get right into it. Stick to the end of this video for my general thoughts on the Rocky franchise as a whole, but I want to start off this video with 9th place, and that for me is Rocky 5. I definitely feel like this is just an overhated movie though. I get people's complaints that the final battle really has no stakes and it's just a street fight, but I really do like the whole idea of Rocky being retired, training this kid, and then the kid becomes a hot shot like Rocky used to be. And I just love also like the neglecting father aspect of this movie. And I definitely feel at times Rocky's kid is a little bit annoying, but I think as a whole, everything works about this movie in comparison to one another. The story really flows. And though again, I don't think it's like a strong story compared to the rest of the franchise, it still works for me. In 8th place for me is Rocky 4. This is the one where he fights Drago, but it's also one of the highlights of the franchise in that it has a really big impact on the future with Apollo's death. And I just love this redemption story as well. Rocky going to train in Russia and Adrian also not wanting him to fight Drago because she's scared that he's gonna die like Apollo. For Rocky 4, I think that it's just the overall redemption story and how big of an impact Apollo's death has on Rocky, but also going into the Creed movies, how much that impacts Rocky's mental health and how Rocky feels like he should have stopped the fight and that lives with him forever. Again, on its own, this movie is fine. Like I said, every movie in this franchise is baseline good in my opinion. Even Rocky 5, it's a good movie, but Rocky 4, I think with how much implication it has on the future of the franchise, I do bump it up just a little bit more. But with that being said, moving on to 7th place for me is Rocky Balboa. This is genuinely one of the better, technically legacy sequels, I would say. I do think the final battle is kind of unrealistic, but I think it's another great redemption story that also implements a little bit more family into this time, and it also really influences the Creed movies in my opinion and just the way that they tell the story. I think as a whole, Rocky Balboa it feels like it's a necessary movie in terms of just you can move forward who Rocky is, and so it works. I think that also the utilization of the past of the Rocky movies and the previous movies in the franchise, I think it all comes together really well here with Adrian's death and Mickey being an inspirational aspect in the film. I just really love the way that they bring together the franchise in this movie. And again, it doesn't feel like something they threw out there for just money's sake. I mean, they might have, but I just feel like the story actually makes sense for the character that Rocky is. In 6th place for me is Rocky 3. I really love whenever this franchise has someone living in super high luxury and then comes out of retirement and then has this whole other redemption story because, you know, they're in retirement and they're not supposed to beat this person. They played this story like 3 times in the franchise, but every time it's really well done because I feel like the villains have a really cool motivation, especially Clubber here. He's just very intense and he's very like, I want to fight him, and there's nothing you can do about it. I'm gonna fight him. I
don't want a man like me to have the title because I'm not a puppet like that fool up there.
I feel like this franchise reinvents itself time and time again, but Rocky 3 definitely feels like one of the movies that's still on the lower end of the franchise just because it doesn't reinvent the wheel like a lot of the upper class movies in this franchise. And here comes my hottest take of the entire video. In 5th place for me is the original Rocky. I know a lot of people aren't gonna agree with this take, but it's just too basic for me. I understand that it had limitations. It was made on a very small budget, but I just feel like every movie after this created a more interesting story to a certain extent. And again, like Rocky 3, I feel like Rocky 3 sometimes doesn't reinvent the wheel enough, but every story just gets more and more complex. And every movie above this, in my opinion, on the list definitely just goes into the strengths of what Rocky had, but also just completely reinvents the wheel in terms of story, motivation, action, heroes, like the villains. I mean, everything is just 100% 100% enhanced from what this initial Rocky movie does. And again, none of this is possible without the original movie. This video wouldn't be made without the original movie, but it's just too basic for me. And I have this saying, if it's basic but executed to perfection, that could be a masterpiece. But it's just so basic. It is so limited that it just doesn't do enough for me. And that's why I can't call it like a classic movie or anything like that. I don't want to, I'm going to screw it. I'm going to put it out there. I feel like a lot of people have this as their number one just because of nostalgia purposes. Like, I'll admit, I think Avengers is one of the best superhero movies of all time, but it's my nostalgia talking, and I completely understand that. But a lot of people are like, oh, Rocky's like super cool because it's basic, they didn't overcomplicate things. But when you overcomplicate things to a certain extent with the 4 upper movies in this list, in my opinion, it creates more of an emotional stake. There's so much more value, especially going into the 4th movie on this list, which I'll talk about in a second. It basically takes Rocky 1, but just enhances it by a million. And I'll just get into it. 4th place for me is Rocky 2. It takes exactly what Rocky 1 had, is Apollo Creed versus Rocky. But guess what? Now Rocky is living luxurious. He's living his life the best that he possibly can, but Apollo Creed wants a rematch, and the emotional stakes are at an all-time high. This movie is the only movie in the entire franchise that genuinely just made me sob. Like, I was editing this, and it wasn't out of like sadness. I was crying because it was so epic. It was so grand. And when Rocky got up right before that bell rang, I just felt this sense of emotion just rushing through my body. I was like, he did it. Like, everything paid off in this movie, and Rocky just didn't do that for me at all. The original Rocky movie, the final battle happened. It was cool. It was great. They had fist pumping moments. It was great for like seeing Adrian and Rocky together at the end of the movie in the ring. It felt like stuff paid off. But in Rocky 2, it felt like a journey from the very first second of the first Rocky movie to when that bell rang at the end of Rocky 2. And that's why I love Rocky 2 so much. I've only seen every single one of these movies one time, so I think over time, Rocky 2 could take over my number 3 spot. But in 3rd place for me is Creed 2. Honestly, it's just below the other Creed movies for me, because it doesn't feel like a Creed movie per se. I mean, I definitely really enjoy the familial aspects that Adonis has in this movie. And like the rest of this franchise, they do a great job of, once again, reinventing the wheel. They kind of take Rocky out of the movie for a second, sometime in the middle of the movie, to give us a lot more development on Adonis himself. And I think that really, really works. But at the same time, the villain is Drago's son, and it really feels like a direct sequel to Rocky 4. Instead of being something super independent like I would have wished from Creed 2, like Creed 1 and 3 do really, really well in my opinion. I also really, really enjoy the technical advancements that this movie makes, especially with, I think they're using a robot arm to do this. I talked about this in my Creed 3 review. If you guys want to check it out, you can check the link in the description down below or somewhere on screen right now. But they have this like robot arm where they attach the camera, and it basically goes like across the ring really, really fast, and it creates this really cool motion blur effect whenever they're going in for punches or dodging, and the camera can like go the opposite way, and it tracks them. So it's really, really cool stuff. And I think Creed 2 is the first movie that introduces that, so it really steps up the action in my opinion. But again, I feel like the story is just too heavily rooted in Rocky himself, and it also, in my opinion, does feel like kind of a cap off to the Rocky franchise. In my opinion, it does a great job of building all of these emotional connections, and also Adonis feeling like he did his job for Rocky. Now Rocky needs to come do his job for Adonis and get this feeling of redemption against Drago's son for Drago killing his dad. And I think to a certain extent that really, really works. But again, I would have much preferred a completely solo Adonis story with obviously Creed in it, but the villain didn't have to be as connected to Rocky himself's lore. With that being said, in 2nd place for me is the newly released Creed 3. Again, you guys can check out my full spoiler-free review, but I want to make this claim right now. It has the best action of the franchise. I will say, I think it also has the best final battle of the entire franchise. Additionally, it's the most creative movie in the entire franchise with Michael B. Jordan behind the camera. The best directed, best action, best visuals. I mean, it is checking stuff all across the board. My biggest issue with this movie though, and I talked about this a little bit in my review, but I really just don't like how loose the movie like never feels. Like, it never feels like you're getting real time with these characters. It feels like everything is just a massive montage until you get to the fight sequences. I also feel like some of the fight sequences could have been expanded expanded upon a little bit, but at the end of the day, I still really love this movie. It's honestly one of my favorite sports movies of all time. A big thing that goes into that for me is the thematic elements of just specifically vulnerability and masculinity. I think the Creed franchise as a whole has done a really, really great job of transforming Adonis's character from actually learning how to maintain a relationship to having a kid and now being retired and kind of opening up his own gym and training these younger fighters. I really love the way that his character is transformed. But then when he gets back in the ring to fight Damien, it feels well earned. On top of that, you have Damien's character, Jonathan Majors, who is incredible. One of the best acting performances in this entire franchise. Again, said this in my review, but he's such just a purely evil dude, but he has these eyes of sympathy and you really just feel for his character at times as well. So just an insanely good performance all across the board. But with that being said, in first place for me is Creed 1. I actually don't know if this is a hot take or not. All I know is that a lot of people have Rocky as their number one. But for me, Creed 1 really just checks every single mark off the board. I think what separates this movie from Creed 3 is the fact that there is so much emotional weight on this introduction of Adonis that I feel inherently connected to him. I automatically just feel like I care about this character because of everything that he's gone through and the way that he goes about being introduced to Rocky, as well as the Rocky storyline with him having cancer and then obviously Creed fighting and actually like trying to redeem himself internally, and also Rocky fighting for his life. I just love the parallels between Adonis and Rocky, and the way that they bring these two characters together is just orchestrated so well in my opinion. I also think it's the most fresh movie in the entire franchise. I think Creed 3 technically is more fresh on just a level of the cameras, the audio, sound design, all of those technical elements. Yes, it's the best and it's the most unique, most reinvented. But this movie emotionally, story-wise, it feels like we're just getting so many fights, but they're also just well done enough on the technical aspect and also integrated really well with the story that has great emotional beats. I also really enjoy the romantic aspect of this movie, and that plays really well into all of the fights and the story and the relationship between Rocky and Adonis. Overall, I just think Creed 1 is the most well-rounded movie of this entire franchise because it takes elements from every single one of the previous movies, but whenever you're implementing Adonis Creed with all of this backstory and this relation to Rocky and Apollo, I think they just really capitalized on it in the most perfect way. But that's pretty much it for my ranking of all 9 movies in the Rocky franchise. And now just for some overall franchise thoughts. Like I said in the very beginning of this video, I feel like the Rocky franchise is one of the most consistently good franchises. You guys can say what you want about Rocky 5, but even excluding Rocky 5, you're talking 8 out of 9 movies that are good movies. They all reinvent the wheel in some fashion. They all have very interesting stories and characters. And just as a whole, the franchise never really gets old. You're 9 movies in and they're still reinventing stories, characters, emotional beats, while still having callbacks and different moments that really bring you back to what the core of this franchise is, which in my opinion is redemption and family. As much as you want to say like, oh yeah, there's a lot of boxing, fights, blood, sweat, tears. Obviously it's about motivation, but I still think it's about just being vulnerable to the people that you're around. The way that this franchise has evolved from Rocky 1 to Creed 3, not only on a technical level, but also just the way that the story has evolved, I think there's just, it's an inherent idea of you just fall in love with these characters. You fall in love with this story is trying to tell. And again, boxing, great. Fighting, great. The choreography has always been awesome through this franchise, but you never have any of that without the emotional core, in my opinion. And people can disagree. You can like the action aspect of it more, but for me, what really just solidifies this franchise is the characters, is the stories, and the emotional weight that the lore of this franchise carries. But guys, that's pretty much it for my overall thoughts and ranking of the Rocky franchise. I had so much fun watching this franchise for the very first time. And as always, let me know your ranking for all 9 of these movies in the comments down below. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time. Peace.